Moving on to session number 20, we are now going to talk about the ENFP personality type, or exploration authenticity. And this will be a very interesting contrast to the ENTP personality type. So let's get right into that. You see the same driver, exploration, show me possibilities. We're still talking about a type that loves to engage with the environment and interact with it in order to create new possibilities. But we're talking about a type that is now paired with or married to a feeling judging process, all right? So authenticity is its co-pilot, and that's about the introverted feeling or the subjective feeling experience. Now, as we talked about, authenticity is about what you're feeling in the moment and what's true to who you are. So what this does and how this changes the flavor of the type, right, ENTPs versus ENFPs, is that part of you that wants new possibilities, wants to understand new things, wants to mess with the environment in order to see emerging patterns, this is now married specifically to how people are feeling, right? It starts with you, and then it starts with the concept of what is a replicable feeling in the outside world, which is what authenticity is all about. How do we replicate these feelings? How do we understand emotions based on the subjective human experience? And so the systems are now human systems, all right? The desire to see new patterns specifically is about people patterns. So what you'll see in an ENFP is somebody who is fantastic at engaging and interacting with other people in order to figure out what we'll call a specific emotion from another human being, all right? As opposed to the ENTP, which is about new patterns when it comes to intellectual or conceptual systems. This is new patterns when it comes to people's emotional experience, starting with your own and then extending outward. Now, again, this is a learning process that ENFPs are leading with, so this changes the flavor of things. It means that they're going to be more open frame. They're going to have a tendency to not be as judgmental in general. Sometimes they can be, but that's not their natural desire. Their natural desire is to be open frame and understand people in terms of pattern recognition. So what you're talking about here is messing with the environment, pushing buttons, pulling toggle switches, specifically with humans, specifically social. So what ends up happening is over time, right, we've talked about how we create strategies that honor our wiring, right, honor our mental processes, and over time the strategies that end up emerging is that ENFPs become master performers. They become very good at performing. In fact, they get so good at performing that they start to rely on performance to teach them or to tell them how they actually feel. Most ENFPs will tell you that they don't know what the right decision to make is until they perform the decision out, all right? They have to actually be in action in order to determine how they feel about something, and then they know the right course of action. Very frustrating to a lot of ENFPs, right? Because they want to be able to decide first and then act, but they can't. They have to decide as they're acting. This makes them super good, though, at helping other people replicate emotions. However, they're not introverts, so this is not quiet and contemplative. This is not about necessarily creating art and then presenting it. It's about co-creating an artistic experience. It's about co-creating with an audience, an engagement of I'm feeling something and I'm helping you mirror it. And so, again, we see a lot of ENFPs that are actors, that are comedians, that are in basically a stage setting where they're controlling an audience in order to get the audience to feel in group an emotional experience. They're very good at this. Now, authenticity is all about what's true to who I am, and if an ENFP is really working on personal development, then they're going to have enough time to themselves. They're going to carve out enough time to themselves to have that emotional experience internally be gauged, okay? And the reason why I mention this is because the 10-year-old process is effectiveness, right? And this, again, this is to the right side of the car, so this is all going to be conscious for the person, for the ENFP. Well, what's effectiveness all about? Getting to the end game, right? Getting your goal accomplished. But this is not about creating a goal in like that we're all on board with necessarily. If the ENFP is missing the co-pilot to get to that 10-year-old process of effectiveness, it's usually about what I want and trying to get to what I want as fast as possible. And it's a lot of times about skipping steps. They do that, though, because exploration has a tendency to be slightly impatient, all right? Even in ENTPs, you'll see this impatience not wanting to wait around for a result. Although ENTPs, because they understand that they have to do a lot of thinking in order to manipulate data, will actually usually show up a little bit more patient than an ENFP will. ENFPs are very impatient to get to their end game. They want to get it done. They want to get their end game handled. So that's oftentimes why they'll skip their co-pilot of authenticity and go straight to the 10-year-old of effectiveness, because they can just make it happen and they don't have to wait around. Now, authenticity is a slow process, all right? You have to go inside and you have to consult with all the different parts of who you are to determine how you feel. So that can take some time, okay? That can take a little while to do. And because it takes some time and takes a while to do, ENFPs will get really frustrated by the time it takes to internally gauge, and they'll go straight to effectiveness in order to force something to happen. Now, if they're defensive, if you caught them in a situation where they just don't want to hear what you have to say, this can look very aggressive when they go their 10-year-old. It won't just be a strategy to get something done fast and not really ask themselves if they think this is the right thing for them to do. It'll be more about trying to get you to go away or this information to go away. So it can actually look very physically aggressive. It can look like punching walls or throwing things or throwing, a temper tantrum that is not specifically emotional, but a temper tantrum that is trying to get the world around it to mobilize to get the ENFP's desired outcome, which is usually get me out of this situation. Now, for an ENFP, because authenticity is their co-pilot, they're not as in touch with that emotional conscience part of them, but they need to be, because this is their co-pilot. This is part of their genius. So generally an ENFP will become the best version of themselves when they are asking themselves what their current core values are. Now, just like an ENTP needs to check in with their accuracy process to figure out what makes sense to them. And I actually didn't mention this with ENTPs. I just kind of want to go back just for a moment to talk about this ENTP portion of them. That ENTPs, if they're not checking in with what makes intellectual sense, will sometimes hand their value system over to other people and will be easy to manipulate to the people who they have a connection with. Somebody who they think is important in their life, they'll give them too much credibility and credence, and they'll hand over that what makes sense process to somebody else's ability to make sense of it. Or basically they'll hand over their data set to somebody else. And in that sense, they're outsourcing their ability to determine what is basically consistent and congruent for them. And that's how the absolute worst thing for accuracy, that's how cognitive dissonance shows up for them, is that they've outsourced their thinking ability to somebody that they really admire, or they've outsourced that makes sense component to somebody else who they think is maybe smarter than them or has already figured it out. For an ENFP, what they'll do is they'll outsource their ethics to someone else. They'll outsource to somebody that they think is really important in their life, or somebody who they think who they admire. They'll think that person has already vetted all of this information authentically or ethically, and they'll hand over their core values to somebody else if they're not asking themselves what's really core value to them. And of course, that's effective, right? That gets the job done. Now I don't have to really check in and figure out what my core values are. I've handed that process over to somebody else, and now I can just run for the finish line. Now, what happens in an ENTP, if they've done that, is that they have too much cognitive dissonance, and that makes them feel very internally uncomfortable, and then it will make them start feeling stuck. And remember, we talked about if they're feeling too stuck in a situation, or if they're feeling too incongruent, what they end up doing is they end up sabotaging a situation. Well, for an ENFP, it looks really similar. If they feel like they're out of alignment with themselves, what it oftentimes will look like is that they start to sabotage their own energy management. What they'll do is they'll say yes to too many projects, or they'll become too easy to influence, and they won't have any direction. An ENTP in cognitive dissonance is somebody who has no sense of self. An ENFP in ethical dissonance has no sense of they have no sense of direction, all right? And that's what they're really looking for. They're really looking for a sense of direction. It's authenticity that gives them that true sense of direction, but it's a slow process that takes time, and it means they have to be trying a lot of stuff over and over to determine what that course of action is. It's a lot of course correction. And if the ENFP is just impatient and doesn't want to do that, they'll run to effectiveness, and they'll get a lot of stuff done, but none of it will be satisfying. All right, so ENFPs, bubbly, charismatic, very, really good at helping, other people feel certain emotions and the kind of emotions they want to feel. And so great performers, people usually gravitate to them, but they can be difficult to pin down as well, just like an ENTP, because memory is their 3-year-old and they love novelty. And so memory being their 3-year-old means that they're not going to want to do the same thing over and over again. And sometimes relationships can become difficult, not so much after it's happened, but before it's happened. Now, an ENTP will, because they're not as in touch with how they feel about things, an ENTP will actually rush into a relationship faster than an ENFP will. They'll rush into the relationship, determine whether or not this is right for them, and then if it doesn't make sense, they'll get out of it. ENFPs have authenticity as their co-pilot, and oftentimes that kind of behavior feels very out of integrity for them. So what they'll do is, instead of going into a relationship and then ending it, they just won't commit. Right? They just won't go into the relationship to begin with. And so they feel very flighty. It feels very difficult to pin them down. Lots of people are attracted to them, but they have difficulty, getting intimacy from that person. And the reason why is because once the ENFP commits, now they don't want to lack integrity and leave the relationship, so they just try not to commit if at all possible. And that is, of course, going to be difficult for them because, commitment is a part of how you reach satisfaction, especially when you're checking in with yourself to determine what is really true for you. And so authenticity will also not just allow them to have a course of action in life and direction in life, it will be what they use as a litmus test to determine which relationship they want to end up in or which relationships they want to end up in. All right, and if they go to that 3-year-old, just like ENTPs, we've already talked about it, when they go to the 3-year-old in a bad, unhealthy way, this will oftentimes look like they're stuck. And if they go in a healthy way, this will usually look like passively being entertained in order to deal with their driver process being overtaxed if they're in a very industrious time period, because whenever we're in an industrious time period, we're using our driver a lot. One slight difference between ENTPs and ENFPs I've noticed is ENFPs are more in touch with their inner world experience emotionally, and oftentimes that can look kinesthetic because you're actually checking in not just with your feelings, but where do your feelings live? Well, there's been studies that say that you have neurons in your stomach, you have neurons in your heart, and frequently checking in with how you feel internally is to check in with your body, like your physical, actual body, to tell you what's going on for you. So because when they go inside, they're more connected with their body, when they hit the memory portion, that 3-year-old portion that makes them feel stuck, sometimes it will show up as if physically, as in they're afraid of getting sick, or they're afraid of physically being incapacitated. Their lack of freedom, that whole idea of having, unfettered freedom, if they are going too much that direction and now they're stuck in their 3-year-old because they're in a time of stress, it will look like they're really afraid of being physically impaired. Whereas an ENTP, because they tend to be more cerebral in their decision-making process, will have more fear of mimetic stuckness or paradigmatic stuckness, as in they don't have the ability to choose what they want to believe. So that's a little bit of a distinction in the 3-year-old process. Same diagnosis, same prescription though. If you need to go to your 3-year-old in a positive way, go ahead and passively entertain yourself and do so in a safe context. All right, so that is the ENFP or Exploration Authenticity overview.